In the medieval world, being born was a gamble against death. From the moment a child took its first breath, dangers surrounded them. Many were born into huts filled with filth, with no understanding of hygiene or germs. Diseases like smallpox, dysentery, and plague stalked every cradle. Parents whispered prayers over newborns, knowing most would not live past their 5th birthday. Even noble children were not safe. Superstitions ruled every birth. If a baby cried too loudly, it was seen as a bad omen. Some midwives even performed strange rituals to ward off evil spirits thought to curse infants. In villages, a sickly child might be abandoned, believed to be touched by the devil. Survival meant enduring brutal discipline. Boys were trained to obey without question, while girls were taught silence and servitude. Beatings were common, seen as the only way to shape a child. Laughter was rare, replaced by fear and faith. In a world where death came faster than love, medieval childhoods weren't just cursed by disease, they were cursed by the times themselves. The medieval home was not a place of comfort, it was a battlefield of survival. Inside, smoky huts and stone manors alike, fear ruled over warmth. Parents believed discipline meant control, and love was often mistaken for weakness. Children were beaten for disobedience, starved for mistakes, and shamed for tears. The rod and the whip were household tools, not punishments of last resort. Even noble sons were sent to distant households to learn obedience, a polite phrase for hard labor and humiliation. Daughters, meanwhile, were trained early to serve, obey, and prepare for arranged marriages they did not want. Fireplaces filled the air with suffocating smoke, and winters froze small bodies as families huddled for warmth. Disease spread fleas, lice, and contaminated water killed more children than war ever could. What made it worse was belief. Parents thought this suffering was divine will. To question it was to question God Himself. So children learned to fear not only their parents, but heaven too. Home, the place of safety, became the most dangerous battlefield of all. In medieval Europe, childhood was a brief and fragile dream. Nearly half of all children died before reaching 10. There were no hospitals, no vaccines, no real understanding of illness, only prayers, herbs, and superstition. The Black Death, smallpox, measles, and dysentery swept through villages like invisible armies. Dirty water carried death, and infected fleas were deadlier than swords. Parents watched helplessly as fevers burned through their children's bodies, knowing nothing could save them. Poor hygiene made everything worse. Waste filled the streets, and rats thrived where people slept. Midwives tried charms, priests sprinkled holy water, and doctors bled patients in desperation, often killing them faster. Even noble families suffered. Kings buried their heirs, queens died giving birth, and families prayed for miracles that never came. Each grave dug was smaller than the last. To be a child in the Middle Ages was to walk with death at your side. Every cough, every shiver could be your last. And yet, somehow, they kept living, dreaming, and believing in a world where survival itself was a miracle. Parenthood in the Middle Ages was not about affection, it was about endurance. Children were seen as possessions, not people, and their worth lay in obedience. Parents ruled with iron hands and holy fear. The church taught that a child's will must be broken early, for disobedience was sin. Beatings were considered mercy, and silence was the mark of a good child. Few mothers offered comfort. Most had seen too much death to grow attached. Fathers, hardened by labor and war, taught cruelty as survival. Even noble parents sent their children away, boys to harsh tutors, girls to convents or forced marriages. Peasant children worked beside adults, hauling water, tending animals, and learning to survive hunger. There was little laughter, little tenderness. A crying child might be ignored or punished for weakness. Yet, amidst the pain, rare moments of love flickered a mother's lullaby, a shared loaf of bread, a whispered prayer for a child's safety. But such moments were brief. In the medieval world, Parenting was not about raising a child, it was about preparing them to suffer. Imagine being a child, forced to grow up before your first smile faded. In medieval times, childhood was a luxury few could afford. From the moment they could walk, children worked. Boys herded animals or fetched water. Girls spun wool, cooked, and cleaned. There was no play, only duty. Those who misbehaved faced cruel punishments. Whips, stocks, or even chains were used to teach obedience. In cities, orphaned or poor children were sold into servitude, becoming property of wealthy masters. They slept on cold floors, ate scraps, and endured endless labor. Education, for most, meant beatings and fear. Teachers used rods instead of words. Memorizing Latin verses or church prayers came at the price of pain. For noble children, the lessons were no kinder. They were trained in etiquette, warfare, or arranged marriages from childhood. Every mistake was met with shame. The medieval world didn't raise children. It forged survivors, and those who lived long enough to tell their stories carried the invisible chains of their upbringing forever. In the Middle Ages, even play was dangerous. While today's children laugh with toys, medieval kids played with death, disguised as fun. Wooden swords, slingshots, and makeshift daggers were common toys, training boys for war before they could even read. Many lost eyes or fingers learning to fight like knights. Girls played with rag dolls, stuffed with straw, but even their play mimicked pain. Dolls were often made to teach obedience or motherhood, preparing them for marriages they didn't choose. Some dolls were soaked in holy water to ward off evil. Others were burned if misfortune struck the family. Children also played outdoors, in filth. They chased rats, rolled in dung-covered streets, or wrestled barefoot in mud, mixed with waste. Infection spread quickly. One scratch could mean fever. One wound could end a life. But to them, it was joy, fleeting, precious, and pure. They played because tomorrow wasn't promised, and when laughter echoed through the alleys, it was more than just play. It was defiance against a world determined to break them before they ever grew up. A newborn's first breath in the Middle Ages often came with the scent of rot. There was no understanding of cleanliness. Water was dangerous. Streets were open sewers, and homes were breeding grounds for disease. Infants were wrapped in dirty cloths, often unwashed for weeks. Midwives, with unclean hands and reused tools, spread deadly infections unknowingly. Mothers fed their babies contaminated milk or herbal mixtures that poisoned instead of healing. The church frowned upon frequent bathing, claiming it tempted vanity. So filth became faith, and hygiene was replaced by prayer. Rats, lice, and fleas lived among the children, tiny monsters that carried death in their bites. Every cradle held a risk. Babies died of fevers, coughs, or rashes that no one understood. Many mothers stopped naming their newborns until they survived the first year, if they survived at all. In that cruel world, cleanliness wasn't godliness. It was rebellion. Those who lived long enough to grow teeth were the true miracles of the Middle Ages. For medieval parents, love was a dangerous thing. Death lurked too close, too often. Every cough, every fever, every cold could end a child's life. And so, many parents learned not to love too deeply. The average mother buried more children than she raised. Fathers named their sons after the dead, recycling names as if trying to outwit death itself. Cradles became coffins, prayers became routine, and tears became silent. Priests told families it was God's will. Some mothers blamed themselves, others believed the devil had taken their child. Superstitions flourished. Charms, holy water, or even animal blood were used to protect the next baby. Children were often baptized hours after birth, not from faith, but fear. If they died, unbaptized, their souls were said to wander forever. In such a world, hope was fragile. Parents did love their children, but that love was buried beneath armor made of grief. To love too much was to invite heartbreak. And yet, they did again and again, because even in the darkest centuries, love refused to die. In the medieval classroom, the sound of learning was not voices, it was screams. Education meant pain, and obedience was carved into the body as much as the mind. Teachers were priests or monks, and their favorite tools were rods, whips, and switches. A wrong answer earned a beating. Falling asleep meant more lashes. Writing errors brought humiliation before the entire class. The goal wasn't knowledge, it was submission. Children were taught Latin verses they couldn't understand and punished if they hesitated. Spare the rod.
Spoil the child was not a proverb. It was a rule.
Some children left school scarred. Others never returned at all. Even noble boys, studying under private tutors, faced cruelty, disguised as correction. Learning was less about enlightenment and more about obedience to church and crown. Despite the pain, some grew into scholars, priests, or scribes, carrying with them the marks of their education. In their silence, history can still hear the echoes of the rod, the prayers of fear, and the lessons written in blood. Beneath churchyards and fields across Europe lie countless small graves, the silent resting places of forgotten children. Most were buried without names, without coffins, sometimes even without prayers. Infant mortality was so common that families stopped holding funerals for the youngest. Tiny bodies were wrapped in old linen, placed in shallow earth, and covered quickly. In some villages, the ground was so full of small bones that it turned into a graveyard of generations. Archaeologists have found hundreds of these child burials, signs of a society used to death. Some were buried with coins to pay their way to heaven, others with charms to protect them from demons. In rare cases, mothers placed a doll or wooden toy beside them, the only token of love they could give. Churches often denied burial rites to unbaptized babies, believing their souls were trapped in limbo. So parents secretly buried them near holy ground, whispering prayers through tears. These forgotten graves remind us that the Middle Ages were not just an age of knights and kings, but of children whose names were lost before they ever had a chance to live. In the medieval countryside, a peasant child's life began in mud and misery. Born in thatched huts, filled with smoke and filth, most never saw a clean day in their lives. Their toys were stones, their blankets were rags, and their meals were whatever scraps their families could spare. From the moment they could stand, they were workers tending animals, fetching water, or carrying wood. Childhood was not a stage of life. It was an inconvenience. Hunger was constant, cold was merciless, and rest was a fantasy. Education was for nobles and priests, not peasants. The only lessons they learned were survival and obedience. The church taught them that their suffering was God's will, and that obedience would bring reward in heaven. Many never reached adulthood. Disease, famine, and exhaustion claimed them before they ever saw 20. Yet, even in hardship, there were glimmers of hope, a summer festival, a mother's song, or a moment of laughter in the fields. The life of a peasant child was short and cruel, but their endurance built the world's foundations. They were the silent builders of history, born to suffer, yet born to endure.
In the dim light of a medieval hut, the cries of childbirth echoed like a prayer and a curse.
Midwives, often the only hope for mothers, carried not only herbs and cloth, but the weight of fear. Every birth was a battle, and every newborn a gamble between life and death. When a baby was born weak or malformed, whispers began immediately. A changeling, a child of the devil.
Many midwives were accused of witchcraft if a baby died under their care.
Some were tortured, others burned, all for deaths they could never prevent. They worked with bare hands, no tools, but faith and instinct.
Blood, screams, and death surrounded them daily.
Even success was dangerous. A healthy birth could be seen as unnatural if the mother survived to Islam. They performed secret rituals, crosses drawn in ashes, whispered blessings, hidden herbs, all to protect both child and mother from unseen evil. Midwives were healers, warriors, and scapegoats. In a world ruled by ignorance, they carried both life and death in their trembling hands. Few things were more tragic than watching a medieval baby fight for life. Even before the first tooth, death waited nearby. The same plagues that wiped out cities also claimed countless infants before they learned to walk. The Black Death, smallpox, and fever spread through dirty linens, unwashed hands, and infected mothers. Midwives and priests blamed demons or curses. Some said the baby's cries attracted evil spirits, so parents silenced them with prayers and charms. There were no medicines, only dangerous remedies, leeches to drain bad blood, smoke from burning herbs, or drops of wine given to soothe pain, which often poisoned them instead. Noble infants fared no better. Even royal cradles were not safe from rats or disease. Kings buried heirs before they learned to crawl, and queens mourned children they barely held. Every infant who survived was seen as blessed, a living miracle in an age where the grave was often their first bed. The plague spared no one, not even the smallest souls in the cradle. Behind the stone walls of castles, childhood wore a gilded mask. While peasants suffered in poverty, noble children suffered in silence. Their every move was watched, every word judged, every dream controlled. Boys were trained for war, practicing swordplay before they could read, learning to ride in armor heavier than their bodies. They were taught never to cry, never to fear, and never to disobey. Mistakes were punished with lashes, humiliation, or isolation. Girls faced another kind of prison. From birth, they were groomed for marriage alliances, not love. They learned embroidery, etiquette, and silence virtues of submission. Some were married off as young as 12, traded for land or power. Even in luxury, their lives were empty. They dined in golden halls but were starved of affection. Tutors, priests, and servants enforced obedience like soldiers. The world saw them as privileged, but few knew their pain. The loneliness behind the smiles, the fear behind the silk. In the end, noble children were no freer than peasants. Only their cages were made of gold. There was no mercy for the young in the medieval world. As soon as they could walk, children became workers. Fields, kitchens, stables, and workshops demanded their small hands and endless endurance. Peasant boys herded animals from dawn to dusk, while girls spun wool, fetched water, and baked bread. Wealthy merchants used orphan children as cheap labor, forcing them into narrow chimneys or dangerous mills. The work was brutal. Injuries were common. Rest was rare. A child's hunger was met with blame, not compassion. Those who complained were beaten. Those who collapsed were replaced. For many, labor wasn't just survival, it was punishment. Parents believed hard work purified the soul. The church agreed, teaching that suffering was holy. And yet, even in the endless toil, there were sparks of humanity, a shared smile, a song hummed in the fields, a brief game carved out of exhaustion. But make no mistake, in medieval times, idleness meant starvation. To live, children had to work. To stop, they had to die. In the Middle Ages, the church ruled not just souls, but childhoods. From birth to death, every stage of life was dictated by religious authority. Children were baptized before their mothers recovered, not out of love, but out of fear that an unbaptized soul would be damned. Monks and priests preached that children were born sinful. Obedience, punishment, and suffering were the only paths to salvation. Whips replaced kindness. Silence replaced joy. Even the smallest laughter in church was punished as rebellion against God. Orphan children were taken by monasteries, but rarely treated as blessings. They became servants, laborers, or choir boys, forced to work and pray from dawn till night. Many were abused in silence, their cries drowned by hymns echoing in cold stone halls. The church called this discipline holy correction. Parents believed it saved souls, even if it broke bit. In a world ruled by faith and fear, childhood was not a time of innocence. It was a test of endurance. For countless young souls, salvation came not through prayer, but through survival. To be an orphan in medieval times was to be invisible. The death of one or both parents often meant the end of safety, food, and hope. There were no orphanages, no care, only the streets, hunger, and exploitation. Some orphans were taken in by churches, but even that was no mercy. They worked like slaves, scrubbing floors, tending fires, and sleeping in cold corners. Others were sold to merchants or farmers, traded for coins, like livestock. Noble families sometimes adopted orphans, but only to use them as servants or apprentices. Their value was in labor, not love. Many were beaten, starved, or abandoned again when they grew sick or weak. Street orphans survived by stealing, begging, or selling whatever they could, including themselves. Disease claimed the rest. The few who survived grew up hardened, nameless, and forgotten by history. They were the lost children of the Middle Ages, silent witnesses to a world where compassion was a luxury and survival was the only prayer they could afford. In the medieval world, doctors often killed more patients than they cured, especially children. Medicine was a dangerous mix of superstition, guesswork, and desperation. When a child fell ill, leeches were placed on their tiny skin to balance the humors. Bloodletting was common, even for fevers. Herbal potions contained mercury, arsenic, or mold, poisons mistaken for cures.
Mothers smeared ashes, honey, or even animal fat on wounds, believing it would draw out evil.
Priests sprinkled holy water while quack healers chanted spells. If none worked, families said it was God's will. Some medicines were horrifying. Crushed insects for coughs, boiled bones for strength, and wine forced down infants' throats to calm pain. Many died not from the illness, but from the cure. Yet, behind every desperate remedy was love. Parents doing whatever they could in a world without science or hope. In their eyes, faith and pain were medicine. And for the children who survived, their very breath was proof of a miracle born from madness. In times of endless war, childhood had no meaning. Boys as young as 10 were taken from homes to serve lords and kings, trained to fight battles they barely understood. They began as pages cleaning armor, carrying weapons, learning to ride. But soon, they became squires and soldiers, wielding blades heavier than their arms. Blood replaced play. Orders replaced laughter.
Peasant children were not spared either.
During wars, they were forced to guard, dig trenches, or march behind armies. Some joined out of hunger. Others were simply taken. Knighthood was painted as glory, but the truth was cruelty. Young boys watched friends die before they turned 15. They learned to kill before they learned to love. And when the battles ended, those who survived carried invisible scars, nightmares of screams, blood, and loss. The medieval battlefield was brutal. But the true tragedy began long before, when boys were taught that bravery meant never feeling fear. In the Dark Ages, childhood was not stolen by war, it was forged by it. The medieval school was less a place of learning and more a chamber of fear. Students sat in cold stone rooms, scratching Latin verses with trembling hands, while the teacher's rod waited for the slightest mistake. Education was a privilege. Few enjoyed, but it came with pain. Boys were forced to memorize endless prayers and texts. One misspoken word, one drop of ink, and punishment followed. Teachers believed pain sharpened the mind. Whippings, ear-pulling, and kneeling on sharp stones were daily rituals. Those who fainted were revived, only to be beaten again. Girls, if educated at all, faced the same cruelty within convents. Lessons were strict, and silence was mandatory. Even laughter could be seen as sin. For all its harshness, medieval education birthed scholars, priests, and chroniclers, men who would preserve the very history of their suffering. They learned through pain, survived through fear, and wrote through tears. In those dark classrooms, knowledge was not gifted, it was beaten into the soul. When the sun vanished behind medieval hills, fear took its place. The night wasn't merely dark, it was alive with unseen horrors. Children were taught to fear the shadows, for they were said to hide demons, witches, and restless spirits.
Parents whispered stories of goblins that stole naughty children and witches who drank their blood.
Wolves howled beyond the fields, and every creak of wood sounded like the devil's footsteps. Candles flickered beside crosses, and mothers murmured prayers to keep evil away. Children believed everything, because in the Middle Ages, fear was as real as faith. No one dared walk after dusk without charms or holy symbols. Even church bells rang at night to chase away spirits. But fear served a purpose.
It kept children obedient, quiet, and inside their homes.
Every story of a monster in the woods was a warning wrapped in myth. For medieval children, night was not a time for dreams. It was a test of faith. The only safe light was the one they carried in their trembling hearts. In the medieval world, childhood was fleeting, if it existed at all. By the age of 7, a child was already expected to work, obey, and act like a small adult. There were no toys, no lessons in kindness, and no protection from the harshness of life.
Peasant boys herded animals or plowed fields beside their fathers.
Girls cared for younger siblings, spun wool, and learned to cook before they could read. Nobles fared little better. Sons were sent away for training, daughters for arranged marriages. The idea of innocence didn't exist. A child's worth lay in their usefulness. Laughter was discouraged. Curiosity was seen as rebellion. Even in art and writing, children were painted as miniature adults, emotionless, dutiful, and serious. Death, hunger, and war surrounded them.
So they grew up quickly, not by choice, but by necessity. By 12, many were working.
By 15,
Many were dead.
in a world where time was cruel and life was short, childhood was a dream, too fragile to last. Medieval schools were breeding grounds for knowledge and death. Packed into tiny, unventilated rooms, children sat shoulder to shoulder, coughing and sneezing into the same stale air. There was no understanding of germs. Dirty hands, shared quills, and reused water cups spread disease faster than words could travel. Plague, smallpox, and tuberculosis moved silently among students. Some fell ill at their desks and never returned. Teachers rarely cared. Sickness was seen as divine punishment, not infection. Priests ordered prayers instead of medicine, and healthy students were told to pray harder so God's wrath would pass. Even wealthy schools weren't spared. Noble children studying under tutors died of fever, their deaths whispered away to protect family pride. Education was supposed to enlighten, but in reality, it killed as often as it taught. The ink-stained desks and cold stone floors of those classrooms held not just the lessons of Latin, but the breath of dying children who sought to learn in a world that didn't yet understand why they were dying. Many boys in medieval Europe were sent to monasteries, holy places that were anything but gentle. Behind stone walls, children were stripped of their names, hair, and freedom. They rose before dawn, prayed for hours, and worked until their hands bled. Silence was law. Laughter was forbidden. A single mistake, a missed verse, a whispered word brought punishment. Young monks were beaten with rods, forced to kneel on cold floors, or denied food for days. They learned to read and write, but at the cost of childhood itself. Books replaced play, and fear replaced joy. Many entered monasteries as children and never saw their families again. Yet, amidst the cruelty, knowledge flourished. These same children would grow into scribes and scholars, preserving history, medicine, and philosophy for future generations. They endured pain so that knowledge could survive. But their childhoods were the price sacrificed upon the altar of faith and discipline. Medieval children didn't just grow up, they survived. Every day was a struggle for food, warmth, and breath. Starvation was the great equalizer. Nobles feasted, but famine still reached their gates. Peasants suffered worst of all, their children's bellies swelling with hunger. Bread was life, but even that was scarce. When harvests failed, families mixed bark, weeds, or ground bones into their dough. Children scavenged fields for roots, fought over crumbs, and drank from tainted wells. With hunger came disease, rashes, fevers, and weakness that carried them to shallow graves. The church told parents their children's suffering was holy trial, but hunger had no holiness, only pain. Fear became their teacher. Fear of hunger, fear of punishment, fear of losing the little they had. Childhood dreams faded into survival instincts. And yet, they endured small warriors against a cruel world. Every child who survived famine became a living testament to human resilience. They didn't just grow up, they conquered death, one meal at a time. The medieval world praised strength, power, and faith, but it forgot compassion. Children were seen as property, servants, or burdens. Few had rights, fewer had love. The church dictated their lives, but offered no mercy. The nobility used them as pawns for alliances, while peasants saw them as laborers to feed the land. Laws protected livestock better than children. If a child cried from hunger or pain, it was ignored as God's will. Beatings were called discipline. Silence was mistaken for virtue. Orphans starved. Apprentices were abused, and sickly infants were left to die because they were weak. Education was rare, kindness rarer. Only those born into privilege could dream beyond survival, and even they paid in fear and obedience. History celebrates knights, kings, and saints. But behind every triumph were children who suffered unseen.
They carried the burdens of an uncaring world, small, forgotten, yet essential to its survival.
Medieval society built its empires on their backs and buried their innocence beneath its stones. To be a child in the Middle Ages was to live on borrowed time. Death was everywhere in the air, the water, the food, and the faith. From the cradle to the grave, survival was a daily battle. Every cough could kill. Every meal could sicken. Every mistake could bring punishment. The weak were lost early. The strong were hardened by grief. Families buried children so often that tears ran dry. Priests called it divine will. Mothers called it fate. Those who survived carried invisible scars, not just from disease or hunger, but from fear itself. They learned silence, obedience, and endurance before they ever learned joy. And yet, amidst all that suffering, they built the world we inherited. Their hands farmed the land, copied the books, and forged the kingdoms that shaped history. Every adult who lived to tell their story was once a child who faced the impossible and survived. In the medieval world, survival itself was not luck. It was a miracle born of pain, faith, and unbreakable human will.